My husband ended our marriage through a single message on my phone saying he was leaving me and heading to Miami with his new 21-year-old girlfriend, and that he had already taken every last dollar from our shared bank account, and ended it with a casual haha like it was a punchline to a joke only he found funny, and in that moment while sitting in my corner office, I responded with two calm words, "Good luck," and he never saw what was coming because everything he thought he had stolen was actually a trap I had carefully set months ago, and the girl he thought was his young lover was someone I had hired myself for a reason. He would soon understand, but let me start with where I was when his little betrayal popped up on my screen. Because I was not crying, I was not screaming, I was not even blinking. I was in the middle of a serious video meeting with 6 senior board members, finalizing a $2 million grant that would help our foundation fund literacy programs for thousands of children across Atlanta, and I was presenting with confidence, explaining how we could shift $200,000 from our admin expenses into the outreach division to double up impact in the school system, and while I spoke clearly, my phone vibrated over and over again on the desk beside my laptop, dragging across the polished wood surface like an insect, and I didn't dare glance at it until I had closed that deal, which I did precisely at 2:45, when the chairman congratulated me on an excellent job and ended the call, and only then did I allow myself to take one deep breath and rub my temples for a moment before finally reaching for my phone, where 5 missed messages from Andre lit up the lock screen, and the moment I opened them my world did not break. Simply shifted, because the first said, "We need to talk right now," and the next said, "Typical hiding behind your work," and the third came fast after saying he was done, absolutely done, and then came the fourth, which was a photo of him shirtless on a beach in front of clear blue water, holding a champagne glass with a girl half his age pressed against him in a tiny bikini, and they were both smiling like they had won something. And then came the fifth message, the one that cut straight through everything, saying, "I am leaving you and moving to Miami with my 21-year-old babe, and I have already drained our joint account, haha," and I stared at it all, still not moving, still not reacting, because I had trained myself over years to be calm even when someone was trying to shatter my life. And instead of rage, I felt something cold and calculating move inside me, because what Andre did not know was that he had walked into a plan he never saw being written, and that the so-called babe he was celebrating with was not who he thought she was. And as I looked at that picture, I felt nothing but certainty, because I knew the moment had arrived. And then came a knock on my office door, and my assistant Amani, peaked and cheerful as always, reminding me about a prep call for the Gates Foundation and catering choices for our next fundraiser. But I lifted one hand slowly and told her to cancel it all because of an urgent family matter, and her bright face dropped instantly, and she asked if I was all right, because she had worked for me for 3 years and could tell when something was wrong. But I told her I was fine and that I would be unavailable for the rest of the day. And she nodded and stepped out, leaving me alone again with my phone and that photo of Andre and his champagne and the girl he thought was his new life. And instead of crying, I stood up and walked to the tall glass windows that looked out across the Atlanta skyline, and I remembered 10 years of marriage and all the times I had held Andre up when he was falling apart, and I thought about that stupid haha at the end of his message. And then my phone rang again, and this time it was Jenna, his sister, who never missed a chance to poke at me when things were down, and I knew she would not be calling to offer support, so I answered calmly and said her name, and she greeted me with a sugary tone dripping in fake sympathy, saying, "Oh, sweetie, I guess you heard the news," and then she laughed that shrill little laugh of hers and said Andre was finally free and so happy, and that he had been suffocating with me, and now he had found someone who actually made him feel alive. And I stayed silent, letting her run her mouth, and she kept going, saying I should not worry, that I might find someone else eventually, someone more suited to my background, maybe the manager from the local grocery store, because he seemed sweet in a simple kind of way, and I could hear the smugness in her voice trying to remind me where I came from before I made something of myself. And I let her go on until I decided I had heard enough, and I said, "Thank you, Jenna. It is so kind of you to think of me during what must be such an exciting time for your family." and she hesitated, clearly not expecting me to be so composed. And then I said, "Please tell Andre I saw his message and tell him I said good luck." And then she burst out laughing again, mocking me, saying, "Andre has $200,000 of your money and a young girl who actually wants him, and you are 36 and broke and alone." And then she ended with the same stupid haha, like they were all in on some joke together, and I ended the call right there and opened the banking app on my computer, and sure enough, our joint account was completely empty, even overdrawn by a little over $5,000. And then I clicked on another tab, one Andre never knew existed, an account my grandmother Big Mama Rose had set up for me the day I graduated college, called the Big Mama Rose Generational Trust, and the balance read over $8 million, and I stared at it for a moment with a still face, and picked up my phone and opened the text thread with Andre again, and looked at the photo and the champagne and the bikini and the final message, and I typed two simple words, "good luck," and hit send. And then I scrolled through my contacts past Andre and tapped on my lawyer David, and when he answered I said clearly and firmly, "David, it is Monique, we have a situation and we need move very fast." And that was the moment Andre Henderson had no idea that the world he thought he had stolen was about to collapse underneath his feet, because he believed he had left me. But what he had actually done was step into a plan that had been waiting for him for 6 long months. The penthouse suite at the luxury hotel in Miami looked like something out of a music video, with gold accents, animal print furniture, and a massive wall of windows letting the Florida sun flood the room where chaos lived in shopping bags, champagne flutes, and half-eaten strawberries. And on the velvet couch, Chloe stretched in her white designer bikini, twisting her body into perfect angles as she snapped selfies one after the other while holding a brand new purse that had cost more than her college tuition, and she squealed with delight, saying, "Oh my God, Andre, I still cannot believe this in real life. Like, I cannot believe I get to live like this, and my followers are going absolutely while they think I am famous." And Andre walked out of the bedroom in nothing but a robe, with his chest puffed out like he owned the entire world, and he took the glass from her hand, sipped the champagne, and grinned at her, saying, "This is just day one, baby. This is what freedom feels like, and this is how I was always meant to live." And then he scoffed, thinking about Monique, and muttered, "She held me back for too long with her boring meetings and her stupid foundation, and always talking about budgets and plans and charity. I mean, who even wants to talk about quarterly reports at night?" And then he chuckled deeper, thinking of her probably sitting alone in their old apartment, trying to figure out how to survive without him, as if she ever mattered. And then he kissed Chloe's neck and said her loss might gain, and Chloe giggled, pressing into him, whispering, "You are so bad, but I love it." And then she turned her phone to him and said, "Look, your sister just posted a story with the picture we sent her." And Andre looked, and there it was, the exact photo he had texted to Monique, with Chloe in her bikini and him grinning with a champagne glass, only now Jenna had added a caption that said, "My brother finally free and living his best life in Miami with a goddess, because some people just cannot handle ambition." And Andre smiled big and proud, saying, "That is my sister. She knows me. She gets it. She always knew I was destined for more than living like some accountant." And he clapped his hands together, saying, "Let's go see the yacht I reserved. I told them I would drop the deposit today." And Chloe jumped up and threw on a little sundress that barely covered anything, and Andre put on his designer linen shirt and slid his sunglasses on like a man stepping into his dream, and they walked down through the lobby, leaving the trail of luxury chaos behind them like winners in a game, only they knew the rules too. And when they reached the concierge, Andre pulled out the joint credit card like a king and slid it across the marble counter, saying, "Andre Henderson here put 10,000 down for the yacht charter." And the clerk smiled politely and nodded, not suspecting a thing. And later that night they went to one of the most exclusive restaurants in South Beach, a place that was more about being seen than eating, where the lighting was dramatic, the music was loud, and every table was a small stage for someone trying to be noticed. And Andre leaned back in the booth like a movie star, with one arm around Chloe, who was now in a tight red dress that hugged her body in all the ways she had learned got her the most attention, and she looked around with wide, excited eyes, whispering, "Is that a real celebrity over there?" And Andre smirked and said, "Who cares, baby, tonight we are the celebrities." And when the waiter came, Andre did not even look at the menu. He waved his hand and said, "Bring us the best, the tomahawk steak. The one that costs $1,000, and your finest champagne, the one in the crystal bottle." And the waiter said, "Very good, sir," and disappeared, and Chloe stared at Andre like he was a dream come true, and Andre leaned in and said, "See, this is how you live, none of that penny-pinching stuff, Monique. You used to do always nagging about responsible spending and financial impact. And I used to say to her, who cares about the budget, we are eating, not planning, a seminar," and Chloe laughed like it was the funniest thing she had ever heard, because she had never been around a man who ordered without checking the price. And then the steak came in a golden case with smoke pouring out like it was a crown jewel, and Andre stood up to record it from every angle before even tasting it, saying, "This is what freedom tastes like." And he poured more champagne and made toasts to his new life, and Chloe sipped and clapped like a cheerleader, and for 2 hours they feasted and drank and laughed, with Andre growing louder with each glass, talking about his big plans, his next deals, his future empire, and he made sure everyone around them heard it. And when the bill came tucked neatly in a black leather folder, the waiter placed it gently on the table, and Andre picked it up, barely glancing at the total, which was $2,540, and he pulled out the same joint credit card with a flourish, saying, "Put it on this, and give yourself a nice tip." And the waiter took it and walked away, and Andre leaned back, already feeling like a legend. But then he saw the waiter return, and the look on his face had changed. It was polite but tense. And when he reached the table, he said softly, "I am so sorry, sir, but the card has been declined." And Andre froze and said, "What do you mean declined? That is impossible. There is $200,000 in that account." And the waiter said, "I tried it twice, sir. It is not a machine error. The message says insufficient funds." And those words hit Andre like a punch. He turned red, then pale, then red again, and Chloe's smile faltered as she watched him. And he could see it in her eyes, the doubt, the confusion, the shift. And then the couple at the next table stopped their conversation to watch, and Andre fumbled in his pocket, pulling out his personal card, the one he barely used with a limit of 10,000, and he threw it on the tray, snapping, "Use this and be quick." And the waiter took it, and Andre did not dare look at Chloe, who was now staring at him, not with awe, but with calculation, and the meal that had tasted like power now felt like sand in his mouth. And the next morning the Miami sun I'd felt harsh and cruel, and Andre paced the suite with his phone pressed so hard to his ear his knuckles were turning white, and he had already been on hold with the bank for nearly half an hour listening to terrible music, when finally someone picked up, and he launched into a tirade, saying, "This is unacceptable. I was humiliated, and your systems are broken." And the representative began to explain, but Andre cut her off, demanding to know why his card had failed, saying he had moved $200,000 into that account just days ago. And she calmly replied that the account had been flagged and the money frozen due to a clawback request, and Andre shouted, "What the hell is a clawback?" And she explained that the funds had come from a trust and were reported as a mistaken transfer, and Andre screamed again, saying, "It was my money, I withdrew it." And she told him the transfer had been reversed and the money was no longer available, and that the joint account was now in the negative. And the phone call ended with Andre staring at the screen, unable to process what had just happened, because it was not possible, it could not be. And then he did the only thing he could. He called Monique, and she answered on the second ring, her voice calm, almost cheerful, like she was sitting at a brunch with friends. And he exploded, yelling, "What did you do? You froze my money. You ruined my vacation." And she replied with total calm, saying, "Oh, that must be the trust, not me." And he screamed, "What trust? What are you talking about?" And she explained the account was connected to a trust left by her grandmother, and that the money was meant for bills and maintenance, and that when he withdrew it, he had triggered a legal response, and the attorneys had reversed the transaction. And Andre's legs gave out, and he fell onto the velvet couch, trying to understand how it had all flipped so fast. And Monique said gently, "Andre, you did not just empty a bank account, you stole from a trust." And he shouted, "It was our money." And she said, "No, Andre, I never kept that kind of money with you, not after the messages I found 6 months ago." and you did not just try to steal from me. You tried to rob my family legacy, and then she hung up, leaving Andre alone in a luxury suite filled with bags of things he had bought with money that was never his to begin with, and across the room Chloe was packing her things without saying a word, and everything was beginning to fall apart, and he did not even know that this was only the start. Andre could not sit still the next morning as he paced back and forth across the thick carpet of the suite, and every few minutes he would stop at the window, staring down at the street below, then turn and start pacing again, his phone clenched tightly in his hand as he waited on hold with the bank. And the classical music in the background felt like torture because he had called them 4 times, and each time he ended up shouting at some representative who could not give him the answer he wanted, and he kept demanding to know why the $200,000 he had transferred was gone, and every single time they calmly explained the same thing, that the money came from a trust that had reported the transfer as a mistake, and that a legal clawback had been processed, freezing the account and reversing the deposit. And when he asked what kind of trust, the woman on the other end of the call had said in a voice that sounded like she had read it off a sheet, the Big Mama Rose Generational Trust, and Andre had yelled again, saying that was impossible, that money was his and they had no right, and she explained calmly that the entire amount had been moved to a new individual account and flagged for review, and now the account was not just frozen but also overdrawn by more than $5,000, and that he was required to settle the balance immediately. And then the call had dropped, and Andre stood still in the center of the room, staring at the phone like it had betrayed him, and his heart was racing because everything he had been showing off had come from that money, and the walls of luxury around him suddenly felt like they were closing in. And then, without thinking, he scrolled through his contacts and pressed the name Monique Wife, and she picked up quickly, her voice smooth and even as always, and he could hear soft clinks of cutlery in the background, as if she was having lunch, and she sounded perfectly calm as she said, "Hello, Andre," and his voice exploded as he yelled, "What did you do? What the hell did you do to me?" And he paced again, kicking over an empty shopping bag as he shouted, "You froze the money, you told the bank, you ruined my vacation." And she said softly, "No, Andre, that was not me, that was the trust." And he screamed, "What trust?" And she said, "The one my grandmother left me, the one that pays the bills for the house, the one you just stole from." And his voice cracked as he said, "I did not steal it. It was our account." And she said, "It was an account I allowed you to access for regular expenses. And when you drained it, you triggered a legal response. And now the trust has taken action." And his legs went weak again, and he stumbled onto the couch, clutching the phone tighter. And she continued, "I knew something like this might happen, Andre. That is why I never kept more than a small portion. There, you stole from the wrong place." And she was still calm as she added, "And by the way, that house you are threatening to sell, you might want to check whose name is on the deed." And then she hung up, and Andre sat in stunned silence until he gathered enough energy to call his sister Jenna, who answered with a sleepy voice saying, "What is it? I am in the middle of a massage." And Andre shouted she froze everything. She took the money back, and Jenna said, "Lower your voice and stop acting crazy." And Andre said they froze it all. The bank said it was a trust issue, and Jenna laughed and said, "She is bluffing, just ignore her. She always loved you. She is trying to scare you." And when Andre said, "Chloe is already suspicious," Jenna rolled her eyes and said, "Well, that is what you get for picking up a child." And Andre said, "You were the one who told me she was perfect." And Jenna said she was perfect for the job. The job is done now. And Andre said, "What job?" And Jenna said, "Never mind that now, just relax and ignore Monique. She will panic eventually and come crawling back." And Andre breathed slower and repeated, "Crawling back. Yes, she will come crawling back." And Jenna said, "Exactly, she cannot live without you. She was obsessed with you, and you kept her life running. She will beg you to forgive her. Just stay strong and do not reach out to her. Let her squirm." And Andre sat back on couch, breathing hard but starting to believe it. And over the next 3 days he followed Jenna's advice, ignoring every number he did not recognize, pretending that everything was fine. But it was not because the hotel did not care about appearances. They cared about the bill, and his credit card was now maxed out, and the $10,000 limit was gone. and the yacht company had called demanding payment, and Chloe was no longer giggling, she was cold and annoyed. And the final straw came when he tried to order room service and was told that all charges had been suspended, and he slammed the phone down, and Chloe came inside from the balcony and said, "Andre, this is not what you promised me," and she looked tired, not amused, and she said you had $200,000, you said we were rich, and now I cannot even order fruit without getting stared at like I am poor, and Andre said it is just a delay, baby Monique is playing games, and Chloe picked up the room key card and said they locked us out of the suite. Andre, they deactivated our key, and Andre was sweating and panicked, and his hands were shaking as he called Monique again, and she answered, and he said, "Enough of these games, you unlock the money right now, or I will sell the house, and I will take my half, which is at least $500,000. And Monique was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Andre, you do not even have a real estate lawyer, and you do not even have money to pay your divorce attorney, and you definitely do not have any idea what you are talking about." And he yelled, "I will call someone, I will sell it." And she said, "Andre read the paperwork, and he said I do not need to read anything." And she said, "Yes, you do, because your name is not on the deed," and he stopped breathing and said, "What do you mean, not on the deed?" And she said, "You never were on it, and the house is owned entirely by the trust." And she added, "By the way, the locks are being changed as we speak, and you are no longer welcome." And Andre screamed, "You cannot do that, it is my house." And she said, "No, it is not. You never paid a dime, the trust paid for everything, and you were just a guest, and your stay has ended." And then the line went silent, and Andre dropped the phone onto the carpet and stared at the ceiling, unable to move, because in just a few days he had gone from king of Miami to a man with no money, no house, and no way out. 3 days passed slowly and painfully for Andre as he continued to pretend that everything was under control, following Jenna's advice to ignore Monique and act like the money would return on its own, and like the world still believed in the story he had created, but reality did not care about pride, and the hotel staff certainly did not care about his confidence, because while Andre tried to hold on to his fantasy, the expenses kept stacking up, and the staff grew more distant, and the warmth that once welcomed him vanished as the front desk began to eye him with suspicion, and the concierge stopped calling him sir, and room service stopped answering his calls. And the final humiliation came that morning when Chloe picked up the hotel phone to order a simple breakfast and was told they were no longer allowed to charge anything to the room because of unpaid balances, and she slammed the phone down and stood silently staring out over the balcony, while Andre sat frozen on the edge of the bed, knowing what she was about to say, and she turned around slowly, her face no longer lit with admiration, and she said, "Andre, you told me you were rich, you said you had $200,000, and I have not even been able to order breakfast, and now people are looking at me like I do not belong here." And he opened his mouth to say something, but she cut him off and said, "This is not luxury, this is pathetic," and she walked away toward the bathroom, grabbing her phone and ignoring him, and Andre felt that cold panic in his stomach rise again, and this time he could not push it down because the hotel had also locked their key cards, and he knew if he left the suite for even a second, he would not be able to get back in, and he could no longer pretend Jenna's advice was working, and with shaking hands he called Monique again, and she picked up on the third ring, still with that infuriatingly calm voice, saying, "Hello, Andre," like she was answering a business call. And he yelled into the phone, "Listen to me, I am tired of these games, and you need to unlock that account, or I swear I will sell the house in Atlanta and take my half, that is $500,000, and you will lose everything." And he stood by the window panting, proud of his final threat. But her voice did not break, and she said slowly, "Andre, you do not have a real estate lawyer, you do not even have money for a divorce lawyer, and what you have is a sister who fed you bad advice and a false sense of security." And he shouted, "I can get a lawyer." And she said, "Can you?" And then she said something that chilled him more than the empty bank account. She said, "You should read the deed, Andre." And he said, "I know what the deed says, it is our house, we bought it together." And she said, "Are you sure? Because I think you should take a look, or maybe call the county office, or better yet, check the safe in the study. Oh wait, you cannot do that because you are in Miami, and I am changing the locks as we speak." and Andre screamed, "You cannot lock me out of my own house," and she said gently, "Andre, you were never on the title, you were not a co-owner, you were a guest, a long-term guest in my house, and your stay is over," and before he could respond the call ended, and he stood in the center of the suite gripping the phone so hard his fingers turned white and the room was spinning around him, and he dropped onto the floor sitting against the wall with his eyes wide open because that house was his last asset, the last thing he thought he could use as leverage, and now even that was gone, and somewhere in his mind he heard a voice, a memory from years ago back when he and Monique were just engaged, and she had brought him to meet her grandmother, and he had waited in the kitchen while Monique and Big Mama Rose had a long private talk, and he had not paid attention then because he thought it was just sentimental family chat. And now he realized it had been a strategy session, and then his mind jumped forward to the day they closed on the house when he was on the phone with Jenna bragging about the new place while Monique sat quietly signing papers, and when the title officer asked him to sign, he remembered her saying, "Oh, he is not on the deed, it is going under the trust name for tax reasons," and he had waved it off saying sure whatever and gone back to his call, and now it all made sense because the trust owned the house and the money and everything, and he had just been a background character in Monique's plan. Now his entire world was collapsing, and all he could do was sit in a suite he could not afford beside a woman who had stopped believing in him, and try to figure out how to salvage something from the wreckage before it was too late. Andre sat alone on the same velvet couch where just a few days ago he had laughed loudly and toasted to freedom with Chloe, but now the room felt smaller, colder, and more dangerous, as if the walls were waiting for the final blow, and he stared down at his phone screen, debating whether to call Jenna again even after she had dismissed him during his last meltdown, and finally he hit call and she answered sounding annoyed and half asleep, saying, "Andre, I told you to stop calling me during my spa days." And he did not waste time, he launched into the same panicked rant about the frozen money, about the trust, about the clawback, and about how Monique was trying to ruin him, and he told her the bank said it was a mistake, and they took all the money, and Jenna sighed like she was listening to a child complaining about a scraped knee, and told him to calm down and stop shouting, and Andre's voice cracked as he yelled, "They took everything and Chloe is already mad, and the hotel is demanding payment, and Jenna said she is being dramatic, and you are feeding into it," and Andre looked across the room at Chloe, who was no longer even pretending to listen as she sat by the window taking selfies again, but this time not with him, and he said, "Chloe is already talking to other guys," and Jenna snapped, "Well, that is what you get for picking up a girl from an app," and Andre shot back saying, "You were the one who said she was perfect," and Jenna rolled her eyes and said she was perfect for what we needed her to be, which was bait to make Monique react, and now the performance is over and she served her role, and Andre shouted, "What role? What are you talking about?" And Jenna said, "Calm down and focus, the goal is to make Monique panic, and she will crawl back and you will get control again, but you need to hold your position and let her sweat," and Andre stopped pacing for a second and said, "Yes, yes, you are right, she will come crawling back, she always does, she needs me," and Jenna told him to hold firm and not to give Monique any attention, because the moment she thinks you are gone for good, she will do anything to get you back, and for a moment Andre believed her and felt that flicker of arrogance return as he adjusted the collar of his linen shirt, and tried to smile at Chloe, who did not even glance in his direction, and he walked to the mini-bar and poured himself the last of the cheap whiskey, trying to mimic the swagger he once had, but it tasted bitter now, and the sweet no longer felt like luxury, it felt like a trap, and by the next morning the fantasy was completely broken because the front desk called and said the balance had gone unpaid for too long, and his personal card was maxed, and the manager had been very polite but firm, saying they needed immediate payment or he would have to vacate, and Andre slammed the phone down and turned to Chloe, who was still ignoring him, and he said, "I will fix this, I promise," and she said, "Andre, you have been saying that for days, and now the hotel has cut off our room service and we have no working key, and I just saw the staff whispering about us," and Andre said, "This is a cash flow issue, I can fix it, I just need Monique to release the funds," and Chloe stood up and said, "This is not what you promised," and she grabbed her bag and went to the balcony without another word, and Andre stood there feeling like a child left in the grocery store with no one coming back, and he sat on the edge of the bed and opened his phone and scrolled through the contacts again, and this time he hesitated only briefly before calling Monique again, and when she picked up, her voice was still calm and steady like she had all the time in the world, and he said, "I am done playing games, you will fix this now, or I swear I will sell the house and take half, and that is at least $500,000. And she said, "Andre, do you even hear yourself? You are making threats about things you do not even understand." And he screamed, "I signed those papers, I picked the paint colors, I lived in that house for 10 years. And she said slowly and clearly, "Andre, you picked the curtains, I picked the mortgage. And that mortgage was paid by the trust every month since we moved in, and you contributed nothing." And he yelled again, "This is my house." And she said, "No, Andre, it never was, your name was never on the mortgage, never on the title, and you were never a co-owner. And if you check the paperwork, you will see the house is owned entirely by the Big Mama Rose Generational Trust." And he tried to respond, but she kept speaking and said, "The locks are being changed as we speak, and after today you are not allowed on the property, and if you try to enter you will be trespassing." And he screamed louder and louder that she could not do that, but the line had already gone dead, and he stood in the silent room breathing heavily as sweat rolled down his face, and the realization hit him that he had nothing left. And then he saw Chloe standing by the door with her sunglasses already on, her purse in her hand, and he asked, "Where are you going?" And she said, "I am going to the pool, maybe some one there can actually afford a drink." And she walked out without another word, and the suite door clicked behind her, and Andre stood there with nothing but a phone filled with ignored messages and a stomach filled with regret, and the walls finally felt like they were closing in. The next morning Andre woke up to an empty suite. Chloe was gone, and her things were missing from the closet and the drawers, and when he checked the bathroom, her expensive perfume and makeup had vanished too, and only her crumpled pillow remained, and he rushed to his phone hoping for a message, hoping she had just stepped out for breakfast, but there was nothing, and he called her 3 times, and each call went straight to voicemail. And when he opened her social media, the confirmation hit him like a punch to the ribs. She had posted a photo already smiling poolside with a new drink in hand, and the tag said South Beach, Miami, and she was with another man, someone older, clearly wealthier, and in better shape, and her caption read, "Living my best life," with a heart emoji, and Andre's heart sank, because even though he had only known Chloe a short while, she had become the last piece of the dream he was holding on to, and now even she was gone. And he tossed the phone across the bed and stared at the ceiling, feeling like the world had officially declared war on him. And then the knock came hard and firm, and when he opened the door, 2 security staff stood there politely but seriously telling him he needed to settle the bill immediately or leave, and he stammered, trying to explain it was a banking issue and the card would work again soon, but they had heard it all before, and one of them handed him a printed invoice showing the full outstanding balance and the dates and charges and all the room service and minibar usage, and the final figure was over $9,000. And Andre blinked at the number and said, "I will fix it. I just need a few hours." And the taller guard said, "Sir, we have already given you extra time, and unless you can settle today, we will be forced to escort you out." And Andre closed the door quietly and collapsed back onto the couch and stared at the palm trees outside the window and wondered how everything had unraveled so fast. And then he called Jenna again, and she finally picked up, and he said, "Chloe is gone. The hotel is threatening to throw me out, and I have nothing left." And Jenna sighed and said, "Andre, listen to me very carefully. You need to stop acting like a child and think like a businessman, and you still have options." And Andre said, "What options? I have no money, no place to go, no way back." And Jenna said, "The story is not over yet unless you end it, so stop whining and fight back." And Andre said, "How?" And she said, "Call Monique, and do not beg, do not threaten, just say one thing." And Andre asked, "What?" And she said, "Tell her you want mediation, and that you will walk away quietly with a settlement." And Andre said, "Will that work?" And Jenna said, "It will force her hand because she wants peace, and she does not want this to go to court." And Andre wiped his face and stood up and stared at himself in the mirror and saw the mess of hair, the tired eyes, and the broken pride. And he nodded slowly and called Monique again. And when she answered, she sounded calm but tired like she had expected this call, and he said, I want to settle, I want mediation, and I am willing to walk away clean if I get something fair. And there was silence for a moment, and then she said, Andre, you finally said something reasonable, and he exhaled deeply and said thank you, and she said I will have my attorney reach out, and Andre felt hope again, and for the first time in days he believed things might turn around, and after that call he called the hotel manager and begged for one more day and offered to leave collateral, and they agreed to give him 24 more hours. Nothing more, and he spent that night searching online for lawyers and trying to find any contact Jenna had mentioned, and by morning he was sitting in the hotel lobby with his suitcase beside him, and his phone buzzing with a new call from an unknown number, and the voice said, Mr. West, this is attorney Jameson. I have been contacted on behalf of Mrs. West, and we would like to schedule mediation. And Andre said, thank you, I am ready, and they set a date for 2 days later, and Andre hung up and felt that flicker of confidence again, and he picked up his suitcase and left the hotel, walking down Collins Avenue with nowhere to go but a sliver of hope still burning, and he ended up in a small cheap motel far from the beach where he paid cash for 2 nights and sat in the cramped room staring at the peeling wallpaper, thinking about how far he had fallen. And when the day of mediation arrived, he showed up early wearing the only suit he had, and the room was small and plain with a long table and 2 chairs and a glass jug of water. And when Monique walked in, she looked composed, elegant, untouched by chaos, and she sat across from him and did not smile, and the lawyers began to speak and lay out terms, and Andre listened closely as they explained the assets, the trust, the funds, and what he might be entitled to. And Monique said one sentence that stuck with him. She said, I am not trying to destroy you, Andre. I am trying to move on and give you the freedom you claim to want, and that made him pause, because in all his rage he had not considered that she too was trying to survive. And when the lawyers stepped out to allow them privacy, he looked at her and said, why did you marry me? And she said, because I believed in you, but you believed in the version of yourself that only existed when things were easy. And he said, I can still fix things, and she said, then fix them without me, and walked out and left him sitting there with a pen and a folder and a decision. And in the end he signed the papers and agreed to walk away with a fraction of what he thought he deserved, but it was still something, and when he left the building he did not feel victorious, but he felt lighter, and that was the first step he had taken in a long time that felt real. And for once he did not call Jenna, he did not call Chloe, he just walked down the sidewalk with the Miami sun beating down on him, and no plan in mind but a quiet acceptance that this was the real end. After the mediation ended and Andre walked away with the paperwork signed and the settlement locked, he thought it might bring him some sense of peace, but instead he found himself wandering aimlessly through downtown Miami, trying to figure out who he even was without the money, without the house, without the illusion, and he ended up in a run-down apartment hotel where the clerk gave him a room with stained carpets, a broken fan, and a view of the alley, and he sat on the edge of the squeaky bed and stared at the wall, trying to imagine what life would look like now, and his phone barely had any charge left, and when it buzzed again it was not Jenna, it was not Chloe, it was a message from a number he did not recognize, and it just said, saw what happened, tough break. And for a second he wondered if it was a threat or mockery or something worse, but then it hit him that it was probably someone from their old social circle watching him crash and burn from a distance, and he had nothing left to say to anyone, and yet he opened the messaging app and typed back, thanks, I will bounce back, you will see, and hit send, even though he knew it was pointless, and the days blurred after that as he waited for the small settlement to arrive, and when it finally cleared into his account, he looked at the balance, and it was not even enough to buy back the life he had lost. It was enough to pay a few months' rent, maybe fix the car he had abandoned 2 cities ago, maybe start over if he kept his head low and did not try to impress anyone. And the first thing he did was try to call Jenna, and this time her number was disconnected, and he opened her social media and saw that she had deleted all posts that linked her to him, and had started promoting some new fitness product with photos from Dubai and a caption that read, Rebirth is the reward for letting go of dead weight, and he laughed bitterly and turned off the screen and sat there in the silence with the fan clicking above him and the paint peeling beside him. and for the first time in a long while no one was waiting for him to speak or perform or lie, and he walked outside into the night air and looked up at the sky and thought about Monique, and about the version of himself that once stood beside her at their wedding in 2010, and how he had believed he was the prize and the future, and now that version of himself was nowhere to be found, and he was not even sure he wanted to be that man again, and he spent the next few weeks quietly disappearing from the world he once bragged to, and started applying for small jobs using his real name with no embellishments, no fancy titles, and no mentions of private jets or champagne brunches, and he got a job working night shift security at a commercial plaza, and wore a uniform that did not fit quite right, and stood by a desk for 12 hours listening to the hum of vending machines and the distant thud of delivery trucks, and on his breaks he would sit on the concrete steps and watch the sunrise, and it was during one of those mornings that he pulled out a small notebook and started writing, not about Monique, not about Chloe, not about the downfall, but about the silence and the stillness, and what it felt like to not be needed by anyone, and slowly he stopped checking his old accounts and let the photos disappear into forgotten algorithms, and even when people messaged asking where he had gone, he never replied, and when Chloe posted an engagement photo with her new boy, friend, a tech executive from Brazil, he looked at it once, and then deleted the app entirely, and when Monique eventually sent one final message months later, saying the house had been sold, and she hoped he found peace. He stared at it for a long time, and typed out a reply saying, "Thank you, I hope you do too," but he never hit send, and instead he stood up, walked to the corner store, bought a cup of coffee, and walked back to the plaza under the early light of a new day, and thought maybe, just maybe, this version of life might be worth living, because for the first time in years he was not acting, he was just existing, and that felt almost like a win, and he kept his head down, kept showing up for his shifts, paid his rent on time, and said nothing when people asked about his past. And one day, while cleaning out his locker at the job, he found an old photo of himself and Monique tucked in the back pocket of a folder, and he looked at it and remembered the way she used to laugh, and how she had once believed in him more than he believed in himself, and he smiled and folded the photo gently and tucked it into his wall, not because he wanted her back, but because he wanted to remember that once someone saw something good in him, and that meant maybe he could find that again. And the next morning, when he clocked in and the manager asked if he could stay late, Andre said yes with no hesitation and no attitude, and he stood by the door watching people rush past with their bags and their complaints and their dreams, and he felt none of the pressure to chase them anymore, and in that quiet, simple stillness he finally understood what Monique meant when she said freedom comes after the fall, because there is no performance left, just you and whatever you choose to become after. And that was where Andre decided he would begin again, not with revenge, not with fame, but with honesty, even if no one else ever noticed. Months had passed since Andre's fall, and while he was no longer trending on gossip pages or being discussed in hushed tones at brunch tables, his absence had created a quiet curiosity among the very people who used to orbit his flashy world, and meanwhile Monique was no longer hiding behind silence. She had reemerged with a sharp poise that caught everyone off guard, and while she never posted long captions or emotional outbursts, what she did post was enough to remind people that she was not broken, and she was not gone, and the first photo that started the buzz was taken at a community event where she was standing between a councilwoman and a tech investor, and someone tagged the location as downtown, and someone else added that Monique had started consulting for a development project, and soon whispers began that she was building something new, something that did not require Andre or his approval, and more than that, people started noticing that she looked lighter, not in weight, but in spirit, and gone was the forced smile and polished perfection, and in its place was a calm fire that said she had survived something and come out clearer and mean, while Andre, who occasionally scrolled from burner accounts, saw it all and said nothing, and tried to pretend it did not bother him, but the truth was it burned in a way that his new apartment and night shifts could not dull, and he had hoped she would struggle without him, that she would crumble once his name disappeared from her life. Instead, she had sharpened, and as the weeks passed, Andre realized the power had shifted completely, not just socially, but legally, financially, and emotionally. And Monique was not just surviving, she was thriving in a way that made it impossible to deny how much she had carried him. and while some mutuals tried to play neutral or reach out to him, most quickly backed away once they realized he had no new story, no new angle, no redemption arc, just quiet monotony and nights filled with waiting and silence. And Monique's new circle included artists, tech founders, and a few familiar faces who had once ignored her in favor of Andre and now quietly tried to realign, and she allowed it with grace but never forgot and never gave access to anyone who had cheered when she was at her lowest. And then one night, she hosted a small private dinner at her rooftop space owned by one of her new collaborators. And it was meant to celebrate a grant she had secured for an urban community center, and the guest list included people who had once underestimated her and now came dressed in respect. And beneath the soft lights and curated playlist, Monique stood in a black silk jumpsuit with her natural curls pinned up and gave a short speech about restoration, not just of neighborhoods but of people, and how healing sometimes looks like building again from what others thought was rubble. And she never mentioned Andre by name, not once, but everyone in the room understood, and a few recorded clips floated online, and someone in a group chat, Andre still lurked and posted it, and said, "Damn, Monique really glowed up," and someone else responded saying, "She was always that girl, y'all just never saw it." And Andre turned off the phone and sat in the dark room and stared at the wall, breathing slowly like he could somehow slow down time itself. And he replayed moments from their past, moments when she had begged him to see her, to hear her, to stand with her, and he had laughed them off, called her emotional, dramatic, said she was too sensitive, and now all that sensitivity had become clarity, and he was left with echoes and ghosts. And meanwhile Chloe was nowhere to be found, at least not in ways that mattered. She had moved on quickly. And while she still tried to bait Monique through passive-aggressive posts and clout chasing, none of it landed because Monique refused to engage and instead focused on her new reality, one where she did not explain herself to anyone, and one where the story of her divorce had faded into the background and the story of her reinvention took center stage. And every time someone asked her how she managed to look so unbothered, she would smile and say, "Healing is a full-time job. And I clocked in early and stayed late." And in private she still had moments of ache, still had nights where the silence felt loud, still missed the version of love she thought she had, but she never regretted choosing herself. And even when the memories returned, even when she saw old pictures or heard a song from their honeymoon, she let the pain pass through without letting it take root. And that was the difference now. She did not deny the past, she just did not live in it. And by the end of that summer, Monique had launched a community initiative, funded partially by the same trust that had once covered Andre's lifestyle and now supported women-owned businesses across the city. And when asked by a journalist if she planned to remarry, she laughed and said, "Maybe one day, but for now I am dating my peace and my purpose." And the quote went viral not because it was catchy, but because it was real. And Monique had become something Andre never imagined, a symbol of self-recovery. And meanwhile, he still wore the same worn-out sneakers and sat in the break room listening to coworkers complain about weekend plans and bills, and he nodded along but never shared anything. And when someone finally asked him about his past, about where he came from, he just shrugged and said, "I used to live another life, but I let it go." And they nodded and said, "Cool," and offered him a soda. And that was it. No validation, just another man with a badge and a clock. And when he looked at his reflection in vending machine glass, he did not hate it, and that was enough for now. Monique walked into the courtroom with her heels clicking softly on the polished floor, and her dark suit perfectly tailored, and her natural hair pulled into a high twist, and not a single person in that room could look away because the energy around her had changed completely, and gone was woman who used to sit in the background behind her flashy husband, and instead stood a woman whose presence demanded respect without ever asking for it. And as she took her seat, her attorney leaned over and said with a smile, "You have already won, they just do not know it yet." And across the aisle Andre sat hunched over in a cheap suit 2 sizes too big, with sleeves bunched at the wrist and borrowed shoes that still had the faded label inside. And he looked like a man who no longer recognized the air he was breathing. And beside him his new lawyer, a fresh graduate who had been hired with a payment plan. Andre still had not finished, laughed awkwardly when the judge entered, and then tried to look serious. And Andre avoided Monique's gaze because he knew what she saw. He knew she saw the man who once told her she needed him to survive, and now could barely afford the gas to get to court. And Judge, a woman with silver hair and a gaze that cut through lies, sat down and opened the folder, and after the usual formalities, she looked at Andre and asked, "Sir, do you have representation for the financial disclosures?" And he said, "Yes, Your Honor," and tried to pass over papers that were barely stapled. And she skimmed them, then turned to Monique's lawyer, who handed over a perfectly prepared binder and said, "Everything is indexed, Your Honor." And the judge nodded and looked at Monique and said, "Thank you for your thoroughness," and then began to read. And for the next 20 minutes the room was filled with numbers and timelines and dates and statements, all of which pointed to one undeniable truth, that Monique had been the primary financial contributor to the household for over 5 years, and all of which made Andre's version of events seem like badly rehearsed fiction. And when asked about the property in Atlanta, Andre stuttered and said, "We bought that house together," and Monique's lawyer stood and said, "Your Honor, we have the deed, we have the trust records, we have the bank statements, and we also have the notarized letter from the title office dated 2010 confirming sole ownership." And the judge read it, then looked at Andre and said, "Sir, this house is not legally yours." And the courtroom was so silent that you could hear the hum of the air conditioner, and Andre shrunk in his seat and said barely above a whisper, "I lived there." And the judge said, "That does not make you an owner." And Monique did not smile or react. She just sat still with her hands folded because she had prepared for this day for months, and she had read every document, signed every affidavit. And now she did not need revenge, she needed resolution. And the judge then moved to the account freezes and asked Monique why she had frozen the joint account, and she replied in a calm voice, "Because I discovered he was using marital funds to support a 21-year-old girlfriend in Miami, and I wanted to protect what was left." And the judge looked at Andre and asked, "Is this true?" And he opened his mouth, but nothing came out because the screenshots and receipts and bank alerts were already in evidence. And the judge said, "Then I see no reason to challenge her right to secure the funds, and now we will divide the rest of the assets according to state law." And Andre whispered, "I do not have anything." And the judge said, "Then that makes this division very simple." And by the time the hearing ended, Monique had retained full ownership of the home, the vehicle, the business shares, and the remaining cash, while Andre was left with nothing to dispute. And when the judge finalized the divorce decree, she looked at Monique and said, "I hope you find peace." And she said, "Thank you." And then the judge looked at Andre and said, "And I hope you find understanding." And the court recessed, and Monique walked out with quiet power, not gloating, not smug, just solid, while Andre remained seated like a man trying to wake up from a dream that had become a nightmare. And outside the courthouse, a few reporters waited, hoping to get a comment, but Monique simply walked past them with her lawyer by her side, and her phone already buzzing with congratulations from people who had watched her rebuild silently. And Andre exited minutes later alone and unnoticed, and sat on the curb with his head in his hands and watched her drive away, knowing that was the last time he would see her from that angle. And there were no lessons carved in stone and no big revelations waiting to be announced, just the slow, brutal understanding that his choices had built this ending brick by brick, and now the walls had closed in. Andre sat in the small rented studio apartment that smelled faintly of old carpet and desperation, with his phone on the mattress beside him, and the ceiling fan spinning slowly above, and the sun pouring through the blinds in lines that cut across the walls like prison bars. And for the first time in years he felt completely alone in a way that could not be fixed with calls or money or lies. And Chloe had left him just 2 days after the court ruling when she came back to the room, saw the eviction notice on the door, and heard him say that the funds were still frozen. And she laughed a short, sharp sound and said, "I did not sign up to be broke," and walked out with her small suitcase and a smirk. And he had not seen her since, and now there was no Monique, no Chloe, no Jenna, who had stopped answering his calls when she realized there was nothing more to gain, and no one left to pretend for. And so he laid flat on the mattress, staring at the stains on the ceiling, and wondered if this was what rock bottom was supposed to look like. And for days he barely ate and barely slept, and ignored the messages from the landlord and the missed calls from unknown numbers. And when he finally did move, it was only to walk to the gas station down the block to buy instant noodles and tap his prepaid card with the last few dollars left on it. And one evening, as he stood outside leaning against the metal pole, smoking a cheap cigarette, a man in a faded shirt and scuffed shoes walked past and nodded, and Andre nodded back, and the man said rough day, and Andre just laughed quietly and said more like rough life, and the man shrugged and said at least you are still breathing, and then disappeared into the alley, and Andre stood there holding that phrase in his mind, at least you are still breathing, and something about it stuck with him because for the first time he realized that the stories he used to tell, the image he used to wear had all been masks, and now that they were gone he had a chance to start from zero, and the next morning he got up early, shaved his face with a cheap plastic razor, and walked 5 blocks to a community center where he saw a flyer asking for volunteers for a local shelter. And when he walked in and asked if they needed help, the woman at the desk looked surprised but nodded and said, "We always need hands," and he spent the day washing trays, handing out soup, and folding clothes. And though no one there knew his name or his past, for the first time in months he felt useful, and the feeling stayed with him as he returned each day. And eventually the coordinator asked if he wanted to train for a part-time position, and he said yes without thinking, and she handed him a clipboard and said, "You show up every day, you care, that is more than most." And weeks passed, and the studio began to feel less like a cell and more like a room, and he started reading again books from the library down the street about life and loss and decisions and choices, and one afternoon he even picked up an old journal and wrote in it just a few lines. "I was a man who lost everything. I was a man who lied. I was a man who used people. I want to be someone better." And he did not know if writing it made it true, but it felt like a start. And meanwhile, Monique continued her life in quiet strength, using her story as a soft warning to others, not in speeches or blogs, but in small ways like mentoring younger women who were starting businesses or speaking to high school girls about financial literacy and independence. And one day, she received a letter not from Andre, but from a legal office requesting her signature to finalize an old business closure, and she signed it and thought of him for the first time in months, not with anger or sadness, but with a kind of distant clarity, like looking at a past version of herself that no longer needed explaining. And she closed the envelope and walked out into the sunshine with her phone buzzing and meetings lined up and her car waiting and a future that belonged to her fully and entirely. And across the city, Andre stepped off the bus and walked into a job interview for a warehouse shift, not glamorous, not ideal, but honest. And when asked for his references, he said, "I do not have many, but I am trying to start over." And the manager looked at him and said, "We all have to start somewhere." And the job was his, and that night he sat on the mattress and texted a simple thank you to the shelter coordinator, and then stared at the screen for a long time before texting Monique, not to ask for money, not to beg, not even to apologize, but to say, "I am sorry for everything I became, and I hope you are happy." And he did not expect a reply, and he did not get one, but he slept better that night than he had in years, because some doors once closed stay that way. But sometimes peace is found not in what we get back, but in what we finally let go. The news of Andre's downfall traveled slower than expected, but it did arrive in whispers and half-truths through social circles and mutual contacts. And while some of Monique's friends reacted with satisfaction or mock sympathy, she kept quiet, never feeding the gossip, never adding fuel to the fire. Because by now she had learned that silence holds more power than retaliation. And one evening, as she sat across from her cousin, Layla, at a new restaurant opening in the city with string lights overhead and soft music playing in the background, Layla leaned in and asked, "Have you heard about Andre?" Monique nodded without elaboration, and Layla sighed and said, "Girl, he is working at a warehouse and Chloe is long gone." And Monique simply sipped her drink and looked out at the night sky as if she were watching something distant and unimportant. And in her heart there was no longer hatred, only still kind of peace, the kind that settles in after storms and cannot be shaken. And after dinner she drove home with the window slightly open, letting the wind brush against her skin, and she thought about everything that had happened from the first signs to the final explosion, and she knew that her survival was not just about walking away, but about choosing to rebuild from the ashes. and over the next few weeks she poured herself into her company, which was growing steadily now, with new clients and referrals coming in regularly, and she began mentoring a young woman named Sarai, who had dreams of launching her own design line, and Monique saw parts of herself in Sarai and guided her patiently, showing her contracts, sharing supplier contacts, and reminding her to never sign anything in haste. And during one of their meetings, Sarai asked, "How did you get started?" And Monique paused, then said, "Heartbreak and mistakes," and Sarai blinked surprised. And Monique smiled not bitterly, but with wisdom, and added, "Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you clears the way for the best thing you will ever build." And Sarai nodded slowly and took notes. And Monique felt something warm in her chest, not pride exactly, but a sense of legacy, like her pain had not been wasted and mean. While Andre continued showing up at the warehouse early each morning, his body growing used to the weight of boxes and the rhythm of orders, and although the pay was small and the hours long, he felt a strange satisfaction in knowing exactly what his day would hold. And one Friday, as he walked out at sunset, the manager clapped him on the back and said, "Good work this week, you are consistent." And Andre nodded, thanked him, and walked to the bus stop, where he sat watching people come and go and wondered how many of them knew what it meant to fall and start over. And at night he read books borrowed from the shelter, where he still volunteered part-time, sometimes fiction, sometimes memoirs, always stories of people who had gone through something and come out the other side, and each story reminded him that redemption was possible not by begging for forgiveness, but by becoming someone new. And though he still missed the high life, the expensive suits, the constant attention, he had also come to recognize that those things were never love, they were masks, distractions, and now without them he had only himself, and that was both terrifying and strangely grounding. And across town, Monique sat in her office reviewing quarterly reports and realized they had just crossed a financial threshold that would allow them to expand, and she leaned back, closed her eyes for a moment, and whispered thank you to no one in particular, and opened her laptop to draft a proposal for a second location. And as she typed, the words came easily, and the vision was clear, because this time it was hers fully, hers built from the ground up, with no illusions, no shared accounts, no whispered betrayals. And later that night she took herself to dinner, a quiet celebration, ordering her favorite dish and smiling at the waiter who said congratulations without knowing why, and she left a generous tip and walked out into the warm evening air feeling light and free. And months passed and seasons changed, and one afternoon she received an envelope in the mail, no return address, just her name written in neat, careful handwriting, and inside was a small letter no longer than a few lines written by Andre, saying, "I know, I have no right to reach out. I just wanted to say I see it now, all of it, and I am sorry for the way I made you feel. You deserved better." And though she read it twice and folded it slowly, she did not respond, because closure sometimes means accepting the apology without reopening the wound. And she placed the letter in a drawer, not to revisit the pain, but to remind herself of how far she had come. And that evening she hosted a dinner at her apartment with close friends, laughter filling the room and music playing softly. And as the night grew late and candles burned low, Monique looked around and realized that healing did not mean forgetting, it meant living fully even with the scars. And that was exactly what she was doing, building a life not in spite of what had happened, but because she had survived it and chosen joy again and again. The weeks turned into months, and Monique's days were now filled with order and control, as if she were slowly stitching her life back together with steady hands and quiet determination. And her company's growth became a constant reminder that even out of betrayal something good could grow. And people around her noticed the shift in her aura, how she carried herself with a calm power, no longer trying to prove anything to anyone. And one morning, as she prepared for a presentation in front of a panel of investors, her assistant said, "You have become the kind of woman others fear in the best way possible." And Monique smiled, because she knew what that meant, and she appreciated it not because of ego, but because it meant she had transformed her pain into presence. And she stood before the panel that afternoon, delivering her pitch clearly, confidently, and when they nodded with interest, she felt a ripple of satisfaction, not arrogance, just peace. and on her way home that evening she stopped at the florist to buy herself white lilies, not because it was a special occasion, but because she had decided she deserved beauty without needing a reason. And back at her apartment, the sky outside her window turned orange with sunset, and she stood barefoot on the balcony sipping tea and letting the wind wrap around her, and her phone buzzed with a message from Sarah. I signed my first contract today, thank you, and Monique replied with a simple "you did that all on your own," and she meant it. And somewhere across the city, Andre was leaving his shift at the warehouse, walking down the same street he had passed hundreds of times before, but this time something caught his eye, a mural being painted on the side of an old bookstore, and he stopped for a moment, watching the artist work, brushstrokes forming a face that seemed to be both sorrowful and hopeful, and he did not know why, but it stirred something in him, and he kept walking, but that image stayed with him all the way home. And later that night, as he sat on the small bed in his one-room apartment, he pulled out the notebook where he scribbled thoughts, and he wrote down the words, "Sometimes the only thing you can do is keep walking until the road changes." And he closed the notebook and stared at the ceiling, thinking about all the roads he had taken, and where they had led, and how much of his past he wished he could undo, and how much of it had carved the man he was becoming. And not far from him, Monique was hosting a small dinner at her apartment with Sarai and two other women she had met through networking events, and the conversation was easy, flowing from business to books to relationships and laughter. And at one point, one of the women asked, "How did you stay so calm when everything fell apart?" And Monique answered slowly, "I didn't at first. I screamed, I cried, I broke, but then I remembered who I was before I let someone else decide my worth, and I rebuilt her." And the room fell quiet for a moment, not heavy, just respectful, and then someone raised a glass and said, "To rebuilding," and they all clinked glasses, and Monique felt the warmth in her chest of being seen and being surrounded by women who were no longer competing but uplifting. And when the guests had gone and the dishes were cleaned, she curled up on her couch with a book and let her eyelids grow heavy, and she slept deeply that night without dreams and without interruption. And across the city, Andre lay awake listening to the hum of traffic outside his window and thinking about how stillness used to scare him, but now it felt like a friend. And he reached for a worn-out copy of a book he had read several times, one about a man who lost everything and walked the world to find himself again. And he opened it to a random page and began to read, letting the words pull him away from regret and into reflection. And the days that followed settled into a rhythm, and Monique finalized her plans to open a second office space and hired two new employees, both women, who reminded her of her younger self, hungry, talented, unpolished, and she trained them with patience and directness. And when they made mistakes, she corrected them without harshness, because she had once been corrected with cruelty and knew how that hurt lingered, and she refused to pass it on. And as she walked through the new space on opening day, with sunlight flooding through the windows and her team bustling around her, she paused by the glass wall, looked out, and whispered, "You made it." And the words were not for anyone else, just for herself and Mean. While Andre had started attending community workshops on weekends, learning new skills from coding to creative writing. And though he felt out of place at first, surrounded by younger people with shinier resumes, he soon found that showing up consistently earned him respect. And when he shared his story in one session about hitting rock bottom and choosing to change, people listened, and someone even said, "That sounds like the beginning of a memoir," and Andre laughed, not dismissively, but with genuine amusement, and replied, "Maybe one day." And when he left the session that evening, the air felt crisp and his footsteps felt lighter, and though he still carried shame, it no longer dragged behind him like a chain. And one Sunday morning, Monique visited her parents, bringing them pastries, and sitting at the kitchen table, where she once cried about her marriage, and her mother said, "You look like you slept well," and Monique said, "I did," and her father asked about her business, and she told them about the new branch and the mentorship program. And for the first time in years, he looked at her not just as a daughter, but as a woman who had built something on her own, and that recognition in his eyes felt better than any trophy. And when she left that afternoon, she hugged them both tightly, knowing that not every relationship survives pain, but some can be mended with time and effort. And across town, Andre stood in front of a mirror, wearing a clean shirt, preparing to speak at a volunteer event where he had been asked to share how he turned his life around. and as he walked to the podium with nervous hands, he looked out at the crowd and said, I used to think losing everything meant the end of me, but I learned it can be the beginning. And people nodded and someone in the back wiped their eyes, and Andre finished his talk with the words, I do not have all the answers, but I know this, you are not finished just because you are broken. And when he stepped down, he felt lighter, and afterwards someone asked if he would come speak at a youth shelter next month, and he said yes without hesitation. And that night he walked home under a sky full of stars, thinking about how the man who once left a woman by text had become someone trying to speak life into strangers, and he did not feel redeemed entirely, but he felt useful, and that was a start. The next phase of Monique's journey began quietly as she entered a season of reflection rather than pursuit, and though her days remained full of work and mentoring, she found herself craving silence more than celebration, and in those moments of stillness she often replayed the past not in bitterness but to make sure the lesson stayed with her, and sometimes she would lie awake listening to rain tapping against her window and think about how far she had come from the woman who once cried over a text message left by a man who did not even have the courage to speak his truth face to face, and that memory no longer caused pain but served as a checkpoint, a reminder of how low things had been and how high she had climbed since. And when she walked past couples on the street or heard laughter echo from a nearby cafe, she did not flinch, she did not wish for something she had lost, because she knew now that love without respect was emptier than loneliness, and she would never trade her peace for chaos again. And across the city, Andre's life had also become more structured, more quiet, and though he still carried the weight of what he had done to Monique, he was no longer driven by guilt alone, but by a slow rebuilding of character, and he had started volunteering more regularly, speaking in youth programs and mentoring young men who were lost like he once was. And he did not present himself as a hero or a role model, but as someone who had fallen hard and was still crawling back, and they respected that honesty. And one afternoon, after speaking to a group of high school students, a teacher approached him and said, you remind them that redemption is real. And Andre thanked him, but said softly, I am just trying to become someone I am not ashamed to see in the mirror. And later that evening, as he walked home with the fading sun at his back, he passed by a small bookstore with a display titled Authors Who Turn Their Pain into Purpose, and it stopped him for a moment, and he walked in and bought a notebook, not to write a book yet, but to capture thoughts, memories, pieces of his own journey. And when he got home, he wrote the words, I failed, I hurt, I lost, but I am still here. And Monique, meanwhile, was preparing for a speaking engagement at a women's leadership summit. And though she had spoken at many events before, this one felt different because it was the first time she would be telling her story not just as a businesswoman, but as someone who had survived deep personal betrayal and risen from it. And on the day of the event, she dressed in a deep blue suit, her hair pulled back and her voice steady. And when she stepped onto the stage, the room went quiet, and she began, not with statistics or accolades, but with the words, my husband divorced me by text. And there was a hush, a tension, a ripple of disbelief. But she continued, not with bitterness, but with strength. And as she told her story, the silence turned to nods. And when she finished, the applause was not loud, long and full of respect. And later, as she stepped off stage, a young woman approached her with tears in her eyes and said, I needed to hear that today. And Monique placed a hand on her shoulder and said, you are stronger than you think. And that evening, as she sat in her car before driving home, she allowed herself to cry, not from sadness, but from the release of having shared her truth. And meanwhile, Andre was attending a group therapy session for men who had harmed others through neglect or infidelity. And it was not easy for him to sit there to listen to stories so close to his own mistakes. But he did it because he knew avoiding shame did not erase it. And when it was his turn to speak, he said, I left someone who gave me everything, and I did it through a screen because I was too much of a coward to face her. And the room stayed silent. And then someone said, but you are facing it now. And Andre nodded, and when he left the session, he felt drained but lighter, like he had carried a heavy truth out into the open. And back at her apartment, Monique was pouring herself a glass of water when Sarai called and said, you were brilliant today. And Monique smiled and replied, thank you. And Sarai said, I hope you know how many women you helped. And Monique said, I hope they help themselves now. and that night as she curled up in bed, she thought about the word survivor and how she used to hate it because it made her feel like a victim who barely made it, but now it felt like a badge of strength, not weakness, and she whispered to herself, I survived, and that is enough. And the next day, she met with her team to plan the upcoming launch of a community initiative to help women entrepreneurs. And as they discussed ideas, she listened more than she spoke, encouraging others to lead, and when the meeting ended, one of her employees said, "You empower without control." And Monique replied, "Power should never silence." And across the city, Andre had begun writing more in his notebook, capturing moments of clarity and memories he could no longer ignore. And in one entry he wrote, "I destroyed what I did not value until it was gone, and now I build without expecting forgiveness." And one Saturday morning, he walked into a bookstore and signed up for a writing class. And though he did not share his past with the group, he poured it into his assignments. And his instructor once commented, "Your writing carries sorrow and redemption in the same breath," and Andre replied quietly, "That is what life feels like sometimes." And as spring approached, Monique hosted a brunch at her office for women in leadership and community roles, and as she greeted each guest, she felt proud not just of what she had built, but of the space she had created for others to rise. And when the event ended and the last guest left, she stood in the empty room and looked around at the chairs, the coffee cups, the flowers, and thought, this is what healing looks like, not loud, not flashy, just full and steady. And that evening she walked to the park, sat on a bench, and watched the sun set through the trees. And in that quiet moment, she thought about Andre, not with pain or longing, but with a soft detachment, the way you think of a chapter that no longer defines you, and she wished him peace not because he deserved it, but because she did. And miles away, Andre sat on his balcony watching the same sky, writing the final sentence of a short story based on a man who ruins everything and slowly learns how to live again. And he closed the notebook, set it on the table, and whispered to no one in particular, "I am not done yet." And night settled over the city, carrying with it the quiet echoes of two lives once intertwined, now separate, but forever shaped by the choices made and the lessons learned. As the days grew warmer and the light stayed longer, Monique's life entered a phase where everything felt rooted, grounded, as if the dust had finally settled after years of emotional storms, and she no longer felt the urge to prove anything to anyone, not even to herself, because her survival had already been the loudest proof, and her success the quietest revenge. And the world around her moved as usual, people chasing goals, families building routines, lovers breaking and healing again. And in the middle of that flow, she existed, steady, clear, not chasing love or running from the past, but simply being, and that peace was her own reward. And in one of her weekly team meetings at the nonprofit she had built from scratch, she listened to a young intern present a new outreach idea, and she smiled, remembering when she had been the one full of big plans and shaky confidence. And after the meeting, she took the intern aside and said, "Your voice matters, even if it shakes." And the girl looked at her with grateful eyes, and Monique felt a pang of pride, because lifting others now felt better than rising alone. And later that week, she received an invitation to speak at a national entrepreneurship panel. And though her schedule was packed, she accepted, because every time she spoke, she turned her pain into something useful, and each word she shared was a reminder that broken beginnings could lead to strong endings. And across the city, Andre had finally submitted his first personal essay to a small online magazine, and when it got published, he stared at the screen for a long time, not because he was proud, but because it meant his truth was out in the world with no edits, no filters. And the title was simply "I Left Her" by text, and underneath, that raw confession was a story of regret, accountability, and the slow climb toward redemption. And the article went modestly viral, shared mostly by men who said they saw themselves in his words, and some who said they would never do what he did, and others who admitted they already had and wanted to change. And he did not read the comments, but he read one message from a stranger that said, "I cried because you told the truth, and no one does that anymore." And Andre replied, "Thank you," and then closed his laptop and sat in silence, thinking about how honesty had once been his biggest failure, and now it was his only compass. And he kept writing, not for fame, or forgiveness, but because every sentence helped him stay honest with himself. And one morning, he took a bus to a quiet part of the city with a lake, and he walked along the edge of the water, remembering a vacation he and Monique once took years ago before things fell apart. And he sat on a bench and pulled out his notebook and wrote, "She deserved more, and I gave her less, and I can never undo it, but I can live differently." And he sat there for a long time as the breeze moved gently across the surface of the water, and the memory faded into stillness. And Monique, meanwhile, was planning a special retreat for women leaders, survivors, and first-time founders, and she called it Rebuild, and she curated every detail from the food to the music to the guided sessions, because she wanted the women who attended to feel seen, heard, and held. And the retreat was scheduled for a quiet weekend in countryside, and when it finally arrived, the energy was raw, powerful, and vulnerable. And Monique opened the event by standing in front of the group and saying, "Healing is not a straight line. It is a messy, beautiful, winding road." And every woman in that room knew what she meant. And by the end of the weekend, women were hugging, laughing, crying, sharing numbers, and building partnerships. And Monique watched it all with a heart full of fire and calm. And on the last night of the retreat, after the final dinner, as the stars appeared above them, she stepped outside alone and looked up and whispered thank you to the universe, to herself, to the pain that had shaped her. And when she returned home, she found a letter in her mailbox addressed to her, with only a first name, Andre, and her chest tightened as she opened it slowly, carefully, and inside was a single page handwritten, and it said, "I do not expect anything from you. I only want you to know that I think of you often, and I hope you are free and at peace. And if I could go back, I would choose you and respect you and stay." And Monique read it twice, and then folded it and placed it in a drawer, not out of anger or sentiment, but as a record and a reminder. And she did not respond, not because she hated him, but because her silence was the clearest boundary, and she believed in redemption, but not always reunion. And a week later, she hosted a panel on emotional resilience, where she told the story of how she once received a divorce over text, and everyone in the room froze and then leaned in, and she said, "I broke, but I did not stay broken." And when she stepped off that stage, she felt more powerful than she ever did before, because she had turned one of the most painful betrayals into a tool of empowerment. And across town, Andre sat at a cafe, watching a couple argue softly, their hands still touching, and he wondered if they would make it, and he wished them well. And later that night, he wrote in his notebook, "I may never be the man she needed, but I will never be the boy who ran again." And those words stayed with him like a quiet vow. Monique's days moved on, filled with meetings, planning, mentoring, writing, and dreaming, and she no longer thought about the text that ended her marriage, because it had become just one sentence in a much longer and richer story. And she now defined herself not by what she lost, but by what she built from it. And in the privacy of her own space, she sometimes danced barefoot, while music played in the background, soft jazz or old school soul. And in those moments, she felt like a woman reborn from ashes, not consumed by them. And she whispered to herself sometimes, "This is my life, and I love it." Years later, Monique stood by the window of her office, the same one she had moved into after her first big milestone in business, and she looked out at the skyline as the sun dipped low, painting the city in orange and gold. And she felt something rare and steady, a kind of soft victory that did not need to be shouted, because it lived inside her bones now. And behind her, the shelves were filled with books, awards, framed letters, and photos, not of fancy trips, but of community events, workshops, her mother, smiling, her staff, laughing, her son, holding a science trophy, and even one from a women's center, where her story had inspired a fundraising record. And in one corner was a corkboard filled with sticky notes and dreams, and among them was one note she had written in her own handwriting that simply said, "You are not what he left you, are what you built." And she touched that note with her fingertip and smiled, and outside the traffic kept moving, life rushing forward as always. And her phone buzzed gently with a message from her son saying, "Mom, I aced the interview, and they offered me the internship. I will call you in 5. And she replied, "I am proud of you always," and then placed the phone down and turned toward the mirror on her wall. And for a moment she just looked at herself, the woman who had once sat on a bedroom floor, clutching a phone, reading the words, "I am leaving you and moving to Miami with my 21-year-old babe." And now that same woman stood tall, powerful, peaceful, and unshaken by echoes. And she thought of all the things she had lost and all she had gained, and how some things are taken while others are earned, and she had earned every piece of her joy through years of fire and healing and truth. And then she grabbed her bag because she was meeting her team at a new restaurant downtown for a surprise celebration, and as she walked out of the building, a stranger held the door and said, "I love your work. I saw your talk last week, and you changed how I think," and she thanked them and kept walking steady and calm, and far across the country in a different city. Andre sat on a small apartment balcony watching airplanes fly across the evening sky, and he sipped tea instead of whiskey and journaled instead of scrolling, and beside him was a stack of printouts with the cover page titled Accountability and Self-Repair, and it was the manuscript of a book he never thought he would write, but now he was ready to finish it, not to clear his name or to beg forgiveness, but to document the truth of what happens when men stop blaming others and start looking inward. And he did not know if it would sell, but he knew it was honest, and that was enough. And his phone buzzed to a message from his therapist confirming their session the next day, and he smiled grateful for the rhythm of rebuilding, and before bed he wrote one more line in his notebook today: "I did not lie to myself, and that counts for something." And as the night spread over both cities, Monique drove with music on loud, her hair pulled back, her eyes focused, her spirit light, and she thought of how endings are just secret beginnings dressed in grief, and how she would never erase what happened because every moment, even the ugliest, had shaped her into someone she respected. And she turned on to the avenue where the restaurant glowed with warm lights, and as she stepped out, someone called her name, and she turned to see her staff clapping, holding balloons and a cake with the words, "You inspire us," and someone hugged her tightly and said, "We love you," and for a moment she felt tears rise, but not the kind that sting, the kind that cleanse, and she whispered thank you not just to them, but to the woman she had become. And that night, after speeches and laughter, and one too many desserts, she returned home, kicked off her heels, sat on the couch, and stared out the window where the stars blinked softly above the city, and she said out loud, "This is what rising looks like." And in a drawer not far from her reach the letter from Andre still rested folded clean. No marks, no tears, just a memory that no longer hurt, and a lesson she had already mastered. And in her chest beat the quiet certainty that her story was not defined by a text or a betrayal, but by everything she had done after, and she did not just survive, she soared. Outro: this story is not just about revenge, it is about truth, pain, and rising stronger than before. If this hit your heart, then you know what to do. Like the video, drop your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more real stories that burn like fire. Until next time, stay sharp, stay loud, stay rebel.